When the cold wind struck the mud-built walls of the houses, a shiver ran through the bodies of the people sitting inside. China, in 1960, was not just a year, it was a condition in which time moved slowly, and life was forced to repeat itself every single day. In the villages, mornings did not begin with a clock, but with the emptiness of the stomach. When people opened their eyes, the first thought was always the same: what will we eat today? And more often than not, the answer was silence. A few years earlier, the government had launched a campaign called the Great Leap Forward. Its goal was to rapidly transform China from an agricultural society into an industrial power. Fields, villages, families, everything was converted into a collective system. Farmers lost ownership of their land, private cooking was banned, communal kitchens were established, where grain was to be distributed according to government estimates. On paper, production was rising, but in reality, the land was exhausted, the farmers were broken, and the statistics were lying. In the villages, people stood beside small furnaces, melting their household utensils, door hinges, even farming tools, trying to produce steel. They were told that this would allow China to surpass Western industries, but the steel that came out was useless, and during this process, the fields were abandoned. Crops were not planted on time, and those that were planted were destroyed by inexperience and misguided agricultural experiments. By 1960, the results were clear. The grain warehouses were empty, yet reports continued to claim that everything was fine. Local officials were afraid to tell the truth because truth had become a crime. If famine was mentioned in a village, it was labeled counter-revolutionary thinking, and so silence spread, and with it, hunger. In the daily lives of ordinary people, fear was a constant companion, not just the fear of hunger, but the fear of speaking. A sentence could be misunderstood, a doubt could be raised, and a person could suddenly become an enemy of the revolution. People spoke in whispers. Even walls were believed to have ears. Children were taught to say only what the state wanted at school, and to remain cautious at home as well. Education was limited and filled with ideology. History in textbooks was shown from only one angle. Cities did have factories, but life there was not easy either. Workers had jobs, but wages were low and control was strict. Housing was provided by the state, small, cramped rooms where entire families slept, ate, and lived in the same space. The idea of private life was extremely weak. The divide between villages and cities was clear. In rural areas, people lived on the edge of starvation, while in cities, the rationing system at least provided enough food to survive. Even so, China at that time was not a country connected to the world. The outside world was a distant echo. Foreign news did not reach ordinary people. China was closed in on itself, ideologically and practically. In the early 1960s, famine claimed millions of lives. This was not a sudden disaster, but the result of policies, fear, and silence. People disappeared slowly. There were no official announcements, no open admissions. One day, it would simply be known that a certain house no longer had anyone living in it. As time passed, and by the middle of the decade, some policies began to change. Communal kitchens were dismantled. Farmers were given limited permission to work on their own plots. The pressure of hunger eased, but the wounds remained. At the same time, another storm was forming, one less connected to hunger and more to ideology. In 1966, the Cultural Revolution began. Its stated goal was to destroy old thinking, old traditions, and old ideas. Youth were mobilized. Red Guards filled the streets. Teachers, intellectuals, writers, and even veteran revolutionaries became targets. Schools were closed. Books were burned. Families were torn apart because loyalty was now measured not by blood, but by ideology. For ordinary people, this period was deeply confusing. What was right yesterday could be wrong today. Those who remained silent might survive, but silence did not always protect. In cities, people were sent to villages for re-education. Young people who had never worked in fields were forced to dig their hands into the soil. The stated aim was for them to learn from the masses, but in reality, it was an experiment on a broken generation. Throughout all this, China was changing, but not moving forward. The economy was stagnant, technology limited, and contact with the outside world nearly non-existent. Yet despite all these hardships, people survived. They adapted. They learned to live with less, and they stopped expecting much. This was the China in which an entire generation opened its eyes under the shadow of hunger, fear, and strict control. This was the foundation upon which the following decades would be built. Time was slowly moving forward, and beneath the silence, signs of change were quietly gathering. By the early 1970s, China was exhausted. The Cultural Revolution had shaken society from within. Schools had been closed for years, leaving an entire generation with incomplete education. Factories in the cities were operating, but output was low and quality was poor. Life in the countryside remained harsh, yet people had already witnessed the worst days of collective experiments. Hunger had decreased, but insecurity lingered. In 1976, the death of Mao Zedong marked the end of an era. In official language, it was the passing of a great leader, but for ordinary people, it was an uncertain silence. No one knew what would happen next. China had been moving in a single direction for decades, and suddenly that direction came to a halt. Within a few years, the balance of power shifted. Deng Xiaoping emerged, bringing with him an idea previously unimaginable, that ideology alone cannot fill the stomach, and that poverty is not a revolutionary virtue. It was not spoken loudly, but it became evident in policies. The 1980s were a slow yet decisive turning point for China. Farmers in rural areas were allowed to cultivate land in their own way, provided they gave the government a fixed share. This change brought life back to the fields. People began to work harder because now the rewards of their labor returned to them. Production increased, food became available, and for the first time, rural life saw improvement. In the cities, special economic zones were established. Shenzhen, once a quiet town, became an experimental hub. Foreign investment flowed in, factories were set up, and for the first time, China directly connected to the global market. Workers labored long hours for low wages, but this seemed like a path out of poverty. By the 1990s, China had changed, though not completely. On one side was rapid development, on the other, strict political control. The events of 1989 made it clear that economic reforms were allowed, but political freedom was not. An unwritten agreement emerged: prosperity in exchange for silence. During this decade, millions moved from rural areas to cities. Temporary laborers, construction workers, factory lines. Families were separated, parents lived far from children, yet money began to flow back home. New buildings rose in the cities, roads expanded, and slowly, China began to rewrite its place on the world map. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. This was a symbolic moment. China was no longer just an internal experiment, but part of the global economy. Factories began producing goods for the entire world. Made in China became a common phrase. The 2000s transformed the shape of cities. Skyscrapers, metro systems, high-speed trains. Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou became recognized as global cities. A middle class emerged. People bought cars for the first time, became owners of apartments, and dreamed of better education for their children. But this growth came at a cost. Working hours were long, competition was fierce. Rural areas still lagged behind, and city life, though fast, was filled with pressure. The government strengthened surveillance systems, cameras, data, identity systems. Everything was recorded in the name of security. After 2010, China entered a new level. Technology was no longer merely imported, it was developed domestically. Smartphones, digital payments, online life, people began to forget cash. AI, facial recognition, and big data systems became part of daily life. Investment in education increased. Universities began appearing in global rankings. The space program achieved milestones. China laid the foundation for its own space station. This was a country that once fought hunger, now establishing a permanent presence in space. By the 2020s, China had become a global power. Its economy ranked among the largest in the world. Infrastructure was unparalleled, yet control was stronger than ever. Social credit systems, digital surveillance, restrictions on expression. Prosperity had grown, but freedom remained limited. By 2026, China had become a land of contrasts, a country where millions lived better than in the past, yet where the presence of the state was felt every moment. A society that had risen from poverty, but not from pressure. China in 1960 was a country of hunger, fear, and silence. China in 2026 is a country of power, speed, and control. What changed in between was not just the economy, but the human condition. One generation endured to survive, another sacrificed for progress, and the third is learning to live with the weight of success. This is the story of China. Neither complete darkness nor complete light, just a country changing with time and the ordinary people living within it.